Man.
Well, I know we're beating a dead corpse here, but I want to talk about TellTale's The Walking Dead. This is a critically acclaimed game from 2012 centering on the character of Lee, a man who was on his way to prison after committing murder. He's riding in the back of a police car before the driver hits a walker, and they go toppling over the rails into a ditch. After a series of unfortunate events, trademark, he happens upon a little girl, Clementine, who has been left in the company of a babysitter. Oh shit, she's a zombie! Left alone with a babysitter zombie lady. Her parents are out of town and, after hearing a set of not so encouraging voice messages left on the answering machine, Lee takes it upon himself to look after her. It's from there that the rest of the game's story plays out, with you doing whatever you can to protect this innocent girl from the encroaching horrors of a new world of death and decay. The game is TellTale's masterpiece, and I'm sure if you were around the game at the time you saw all the awards it was being hailed with, and they were rightly deserved. Let's Players were all over it, and given that this is the early 2010s, where Let's Players were the primary reason people went to YouTube back then, it was just the right time for TellTale to put themselves on the map. Now, I'm going to talk a lot of major spoilers about the entirety of the series. If you want to play it or whatever, do that, or just scream into the void for the remainder of the video until it's done so you don't hear them. The storytelling is filled with wit and with heartache alongside a cast of characters you couldn't help but adore. Or loathe. Fuck you, Larry! And with the idea of choosing who lives and who dies, the players were enticed into this web of outcomes the game would provide if you made certain decisions. The Walking Dead game runs episodically too, which is an odd format to release your games in, but kind of made sense given that each experience in the game was around 2 hours apiece. And hype for the game could be kept consistent over the year as each piece of the story was unveiled. At the end of each episode, there would be 5 main choices that you would have made at some point in the episode that compared with other people who played the game, promoting the idea of you talking to your friends about those choices and seeing how different the playthroughs you had were to your friends. All in all, the first season had everything going for it, especially for being a game that was propped up by an extremely popular television series at the time, and for it to be one of the first point-and-click adventure games to receive any sort of media coverage in quite a while. Despite the widespread praise and acclaim, however, there was one particular scene in the 3rd episode of the game that proved particularly divisive. The group leave the motel they've been sheltering in after it's become overrun with walkers and bandits. Among this, medicine has gone missing and the group have started becoming almost violently aggressive with one another, particularly Lily and Carley. Dog... Shit. If you choose to save Doug, I guess he tries his best. Lily relentlessly grills Ben, a young, anxiety-riddled teen, about where the stolen supplies have went before they hit a walker. They stop to remove the body from being trapped underneath the RV they're driving in, and this shot is where the audience understood the meaning of their choice to save Carley.
Now, what the fuck's the problem?
Carley, or Doug, I guess, is shot by Lily, which for the player is a big punch to the gut because you actively chose to save them over the other in the first episode. This now means that choice was worthless to the overall survival of Carley or Doug, and from this, the audience learned that the choices only carry so far. So from this, I want to look into the game and farther on into the series to see how this one scene transforms into the overall predictability of the game's outcome and the intelligence of the audience who watch it. Tropes are things, events, or themes which are recurrently present within multiple pieces of media, fictional or otherwise, which critics and audience members notice to the extent that they sometimes can earn a particular title. This can be literally almost anything, such as red shirts dying in Star Trek, character archetypes in anime like the Genki Girl, or even company habits such as EA being the devil and making sure the Sims games have a ridiculous amount of expansion packs for in case you needed your fix of hardcore capitalism in the form of knitting. Fuck yeah, yarn baskets! Ah! So what is it about Carley or Doug's death that defines something to be almost a rule in the series? That main characters who live as a result of your actions only live for 2 more episodes maximum. This is true for the first season because Carley or Doug live the longest as a result of the player's personal choice. Additionally, no main characters live or die in a similar choice of fashion in episodes 2 or 3. That same character Ben we mentioned earlier can die in episode 4 if you decide to drop him from a bell tower to be eaten alive. Yes, I'm calling out if you dropped him because literally nothing bad happens, except Kenny getting angry with you, which if you play this game, you'll find that Kenny does this pretty often, so you're pretty much used to it at this point. Ben dies in episode 5 about halfway in anyway to a very similar cause of death, so that works out well even if you did save him. So with Ben's death, it meant that all determinate main characters die anyway later on in the series regardless of the player's choices. This trope was rather frustrating for us playing the game because one of the main selling points of the game turns out not to matter as much as we initially thought it would, and it really wants to remind us as the audience that the story is tailored to how you play by placing this at the beginning of each episode before you start. On top of Carley or Doug's death, this is the first major death in the group that precedes 3 other main characters leaving the group through either suicide, mercy killing, or abandoning the group, meaning you start this episode with 8 people and half of your group are gone by the halfway point, discounting Chuck, of the episode, no matter what you choose to do. So yeah, episode 3 is a heavy hitter. What's worse on Carley's side of things is the character relationship you can potentially begin to follow through episodes 2 and 3, forming the beginnings of a functioning relationship with her before she is unceremoniously killed off by a paranoid Lily. This death served to be the first issue with the series in terms of the audience's intelligence to the capabilities of the game's system and storyline. Because we know that determinant characters cannot survive the endgame through the evidence the game has provided, it consequently disrupts and removes a lot of the connection the player has to the character, or in another way to look at it, has you constantly waiting in anxiety for the character you chose to live eventually be killed in another fashion. The first time, it is shocking as you have no prior experiences with the game's internal rules and trends to follow. However, generally speaking, people amongst respective fandoms and regulars of similar games to The Walking Dead will recognise the death flags for characters, such as wrapping up a narrative arc despite it not being anywhere near the end of the episode yet, or even just the fact that no one has died in a while, and as the series progresses, people will become steadily familiar with its patterns and style enough to predict certain outcomes more and more successfully. The game then has to rely on its storytelling, which for the first season of the game was great, to make up for the choices in the game not providing as much depth and scope as the audience initially first thought, in order for the surviving character of your choice not just sit there and just say, thanks, I'm alive now, and then not do anything for the remainder of the episode, but we'll talk about that in a little while. The problem with most branching stories is that there's usually some way in which the game railroads you into the overarching story, with some frills being a shade of lavender instead of a shade of royal purple. Or for TellTale's case, we got an action girl with a gun a bit longer over the tech nerd. Carley makes more sense narratively speaking to be there for the time she was, however. She has tension with Lily and Larry, both of whom constantly pick on Lee, the protagonist, and Kenny over small things. She has a pre-established relationship with Lee and was offered to be a potential love interest for Lee by the time the 3rd episode rolled around. So when Lily shoots her, it feels as if those were the intended events from the developer's standpoint. The two have had a fair amount of animosity towards one another for most of the 2nd and 3rd episode, so the climax for this tension needed to reach its peak, and that was the moment they chose. But for Doug? He shot entirely by accident because in this case Lily wanted to shoot Ben. Doug has rarely been the type to take part in internal conflicts within the group and had little interaction with Ben. So to have him decide to be all, no, we, not Ben, it did feel more forced and strange. This may be because in effect you are writing 2 separate stories to lead to the same outcome. Naturally, one of them is going to be superior to the other. I'm not entirely a fan of the idea that they had to die at the exact same point in the episode, as it almost feels like they killed off Carley and needed a way to kill Doug so people weren't annoyed he survived longer than her. I think the reason for this partially is that Carley was saved at a frighteningly higher rate than Doug, so it becomes imperative that the person around 75% of the player base saved had a decent story to hold themselves up before they end up killed. So Doug sadly not only had less focus from the player base, but also the writers and developers of the game. This comes after the 1st episode didn't really touch upon Doug's purpose in the game all that much either. With Carley having a relation to Lee via her knowing about his past as a murderer, the player having to trust her with that information alongside her being consistently there to help you and the group, such as when you go to the motel to save Glenn. Doug only got the bit with the remote control in the 1st episode, which ultimately failed to even distract the walkers. The game also literally tells you multiple times,
You're a good shot, and I'd like to keep it that way.
I'll take Carley and her dead eye down to the motor inn.
and consistently helps you out, so when offered the choice, the game really struggles not to say, choose her over Doug. It doesn't even stop there, she even features in the 1st episode's selection screen. Most of Doug's dialogue, save for the remote control part, is optional, and the framing of the shots in the drugstore frames Carley nearer to the camera with Doug somewhat hidden in the background. In short, Doug appears to have been fucked from the start. Doug's story after saving him doesn't really seem to go all that far either. He has survivor's guilt after you chose him over Carley, so he wants to become stronger through his understanding of technology. There he tries to make traps to detect walkers and other people, which mostly works, but this development in his character is never touched upon in the same way as Carley has interacted with Lee. He has his moments throughout his time with the group, but unfortunately he appeared to have been relegated to something of a comic relief with the occasional side gag as an adorable goofball. This is by far, however, the best treatment of determinate characters in the series regardless, as there are much worse examples of this later down the line. So with the limitations of the game's mechanics now in place, we move to Season 2. Lee's dead, Clementine is left alone fending for herself, and we as the player take control of her. It was an interesting idea to have us play as an 11-year-old child in the middle of the apocalypse, but it offered different challenges that Lee never had to struggle with, such as enemies overpowering you, and the treatment Clementine faces as a child compared to how people spoke to you playing as Lee. And boy, what a treatment it was. Okay, let's keep this quick. The writing in the second season was really shaky. Characters would do total 180s on how they perceive Clementine, undo previous decisions that fit the character, and build up plot points only to then remove and dismiss them later onwards. Don't get me wrong, everything in the cabin worked for me rather well. The atmosphere was the most tense it's been for a while, and the dynamic between Clem and this group of cabin survivors was interesting. You knew who most of the characters were. Rebecca's a dick. Pete's a stoic old man, Nick's a doofus, Luke's the nice guy you'll like, Alvin's the comic relief, Sarah's the weirdo, I guess, and Carlos is the doctor that'll inevitably die. We also get a scene with almost every person individually to help us get to know the others, which was pretty well executed. There was a similar method with the previous season in the drugstore, and it worked rather well for us to understand who these people were then. Without the slightest loss of truth and commitment in playing a specific scene, storytellers must make sure they don't allow inappropriate choices to distort the character's function in the story and disrupt the shape and flow of the story as a whole. There's, however, a fault in most of the initial party of people you come across in the first episode almost as soon as they leave said cabin. Rebecca starts by thinking you're a horrid demon child, especially if you blackmail her about who her baby's father really is. Yes, it goes there, and worse. Before her being pretty warm to you in the very next episode, which makes no sense if you manipulated her. Sarah and Carlos's relationship is clearly established in the first 2 episodes and just fizzles out by the 3rd episode without any actual focus on Carlos's intentions for protecting Sarah like he does without some weird vague explanation, probably some ableist bullshit, I don't know. And then there's Nick. Initially, people began to think of him as Ben 2.0, a character who is trying their best to help but consistently appears to fuck things up at any given turn, including the first showing of an LGBT relationship in the game, but nope! He can die in episode 2, and as we saw with the determinant characters, he dies later in the game in episode 4. But here's the annoying part. He's barely even present from the moment you save him. In episode 3, this is going to be the sole mandatory interaction you'll have with him throughout the entire episode, and it just oozes with the idea of the writer saying, so Nick's alive, and we need to make sure the player remembers that, and then signed him off the quota for the episode and left it there. But yes, please do remind the players of this every episode. Okay, I'm not going to go too much into how the choices in the game don't matter. I feel like it's something that we're all aware of by now. From Season 1, we see that determinant characters don't make it to the end. So when Nick, Sarah, Alvin, Bonnie, Jane, or Kenny die on their first opportunity, we as the players can infer that they're going to die at some other point down the line, maybe say for Bonnie, but she just kind of fucks off later in the episode in order to tie up that loose end. Kenny and Jane survive the episode if you pick them, but Season 3 decides to take care of that. The difference between the first and second season's choices though is the way the other characters see you. If you killed the St. John's in the second episode of the first season, the characters will actually remember that, or if you help Lily instead of Kenny in episode 2, Kenny will use that against you later on. But if you helped Sarah in episode 3 with her gardening thing, I don't know, no one remembers that. If you help her in episode 4, she dies later that same episode with little reason for it to have any impact on the group. In fact, there's a fairly large amount of choices related to Sarah that are implied to be important, but nothing ever becomes of it because Jane and Kenny have fully taken the spotlight from the cabin cast by episode 3. Season 2's major failing was ignoring the cabin survivors after episode 2 in order to set up the episode 5 finale. Jane is introduced and is quickly made a key character. Kenny constantly goes Rambo on everything, and the remainder of the group kinda just sit around commenting on how the others are doing, save for maybe Luke. There's no continuation of the group's dynamic here, which is why Season 1's group works better than Season 2's. There's just too much going on with certain characters for there just to be enough time to focus on this cabin group. Right, we have determinant characters not really factoring into the endgame content for Season 1. What does Season 2 offer the audience in terms of series assumptions? My answer to this will be plot armor and questionable story decisions. Season 2 has some janky writing, potentially the worst of the series if you ask me, though closely followed by Season 3, which I'll get onto in a bit. Everyone treats Clementine like an adult or as a child at random intervals. I would have thought that they would have treated her like they did Sarah, at least initially, but no, it genuinely gets really weird. I think the most jarring example of this is in episode 5 after Luke dies, meaning all of the cabin survivors have now died save for Rebecca's baby. If Bonnie is alive, because she can die at the lake, but I'd say only about 20% of players experience this naturally, Bonnie will then decide to go on this introspective discussion about what she wants from other people in life out of nowhere, but not before she just looks to you and offers Clem a cigarette? What? I am so... huh? What? This conversation could have been really funny for the audience if it was set up correctly. I wouldn't even care about this if right before she gave it to you, she'd be like, oh, what am I doing giving this to a kid? Gosh, this whole thing's really getting to me, huh? But it's played totally serious and ends up feeling like Bonnie is just forgetting she's talking to an 11-year-old child. Don't get me wrong, I've had weird conversations around people when I was the same age, but they were usually drunk. And as far as I'm aware, Bonnie did not decide to just shot a load of Jaeger and then say, hey, let's empty my worries onto this child. She'll even blame you for not helping, if that's what happened at the lake, as if sending you, the child, into the depths of the freezing water is the most rational course of action for you to take. I understand it's the apocalypse, but Christ, what is this section of writing? This is why framing the conversation from the point of view of an 11-year-old feels disjointed. You can't be punished because then it nearly always looks like the adult is just being an asshole to a kid who didn't know any better, and that means you theoretically could get away with a lot more shit than Lee could have. But you don't when the plot decides Clem's capable of hearing conversations that an 11-year-old generally couldn't or shouldn't be handling. Season 2 was just messy in its direction post episode 1, and there's already a sense of diminishing returns when it comes to jabbing into the series for its pacing this season. But we're not done yet with the series. Season 3 continues the trend of awkward storytelling and janky characterization and follows Harvey and his family throughout the apocalypse. Family is front and center and is one of the themes in this series, which personally for me isn't my favourite narrative hook to base my decisions upon. I've never been keen on the notion of someone being important to you purely because of their relation to you in the family tree as opposed to actual substantial reasoning for them to having meaning to you in your life beyond blood. So long story short, Harvey is maybe with Kate. The game doesn't want that decided until you outwardly state it yourself, and Kate has a husband called David who is your brother. There's Kate and David's two children, Mariana and Gabrielle, and they're out surviving after David was lost, but not killed, somewhere down the line. Harvey is an entirely new perspective unrelated to the events of Clementine and Lee, which means we get a fresh start with new characters without having the emotional pressure of picking someone we already had a... Just kidding, here's Clementine and she's doing the asshole biting the apple while casually disregarding most people's safety in order to find AJ, which we find out has gone missing through a set of flashbacks that are there to basically kill off Kenny and Jane and provide the motivation for Clementine to be anywhere near Harvey in the first place. There's two main things I want to talk about this season. I'm not wanting to retell the plot with a snarky tone quite scene to scene, so if you want to find out the general summary of the game, there's plenty of similar videos that'll do it more comprehensively. So we have Conrad, right? He's a dude that pops up around the later half of episode 1, kinda there, nothing to write home about in terms of nuanced characterization or reputable undertaking of POC representation. You know, the usual. But this guy, he has something different about him that no one else has. He can die in 3 separate episodes depending on player choice and survive through to the end. I know, groundbreaking. He can die in episode 2, 3 and 4 or survive to the end with the group. He He however has a similar undertaking as a result to what we saw with Nick in season 2, with Conrad deciding to just be indifferent to the group's squabbling, which I honestly can totally get behind because some of the arguments people have in the series is downright pathetic. While I respect that TellTale finally managed to keep a determinate character alive through to the end, the character's relevance was ultimately negligible to the overarching narrative of the story. He was supposed to, by the game's presentation of Conrad, die in the tunnel and that was it. The fact he kept on living afterwards felt as though he was just waiting for his turn to say the few lines of dialogue like Nick did, and that made him feel strange. Or if he died later, you're left unfazed by how he dies. You knew it was coming, the game has long set up this trend by now. It's so strange that this was kept on because it felt like he remained alive purely to just show the players it was merely possible to keep someone you chose to survive the game. Even if the game doesn't expect you to apparently get Conrad's third death because of how Kate's model reacts when she finds out she accidentally ran him over. Another among these awkward continuations of character survival is Ava, and I'm just going to show her death scene and we'll move on. Please just trust me, you'll understand when you see it and we won't have to listen to me talk about her.
You've got to be more careful.
I was being... Oh, fuck! Ah! Holy shit! Oh my god! Ava! Fuck! God damn it, no! I'm sorry, man. I know she was important to you. I would have died a long time ago without her. Thank you, Ava. Goodbye, my friend.
So yeah, this is a bit of a recurring problem throughout the season. Too many character deaths, too much going on in a short space of time for the characters to recover and lament the passing of events without feeling like that. The second part is this infamous choice. So it's a flashback. Again, there's literally 2 per episode near enough, and I don't know who thought that was an acceptable idea. But it's with Kate in a kitchen and the scene kinda wants the player to flirt with her from what Kate's saying to Harvey, or at least show that Kate has some romantic feelings towards him. Kate accidentally breaks David's favourite mug while washing the dishes and cuts her hand trying to grab at the pieces, so Harvey patches her up before David interrupts her and sees the 2 of them like this. After David verbally shouts down the 2 of them, the option to tell him off appears. This is what is said when you choose this.
You know what, David? Time for you to open your eyes. Kate's gonna leave your ass. What? She told me so.
Honey!
You said that?
Jesus fucking Christ, no! We were talking about traveling and I just... No, I definitely didn't say that. At all.
Naturally, with text having to inform the player what is going to be said by you, sometimes the tone can be quite a bit different than what you'd expect. We've all misread a text from a friend sounding much more aggressive than they initially meant it to be. But with this choice, it is entirely a different sentiment. In what world does tell him off equate to Kate is an adulterer, what are you gonna do about it? The game then tells you off basically for doing that, as if choosing that option is clearly the stupid decision to make. But miscommunications in these types of games can and will happen, especially if the game adds more dialogue than you intended to, which could entirely screw up the context you were thinking of. The phrase, "not now," could be interpreted as a polite request or straight up, "not now, bitch, shut the fuck up." My opinion on how to fix certain things like this, if the game isn't one in which the protagonist isn't a blank slate, is to provide choices on who the person, i.e. the protagonist, is. If this character would never say something like that, why make it a choice? We do not necessarily need a good, bad, or sarcastic choice each and every time a prompt comes up on screen, Fallout 4. So while it is important for the player to be provided different alternatives to the same prompt, there shouldn't be such a wide margin of morality for the player to choose from. So with that, let's see if the final season does this any justice. The final season brings us back to Clementine and AJ, who can now talk, and the 2 have a sort of parallel dynamic to how it was with Lee and Clem. AJ, however, has grown up during the times of the apocalypse, so his thoughts and feelings throughout the series are much different to Clem's, thus asking the player if we want to see this boy's humanity fade in order for him to survive such a world. The story overall seems much more promising this time around. There aren't characters dying left and right for shock value or misery porn like in seasons 2 and 3, and I just want to jump straight into his treatment of choices. They are much more overt in their later effects throughout the story. if you shove Abel into walkers, he's back with a missing arm and just doesn't die immediately. You can have Lily, Ten, Violet, Lewis, or James die mostly at separate points in the game, and they all can survive through to the end, alongside having optional romances with Violet or Lewis, and your relationship with them will also determine how a couple of them are maimed or killed. But most importantly, the determinant characters still remain important to the story even after their potential death scene. Scenes don't feel like they were added purely to fulfill a quota like Nick or Conrad, and the character you romance becomes one of the closest characters you interact with. The game does also show a clear parallel to Lee's death scene, but with Clementine actually surviving, with some initially mixed responses. I think this was the right thing to do, especially with TellTale going under literally halfway through the release schedule of the game. So to have something as strange as even a potential ending where Clementine dies would feel pointless. You as the player, if you knew there were circumstances where she lives, would just reload to the point in the game that decides this outcome and go for that ending instead. A lot of what the series was known for, determinant characters not mattering to the overarching story, janky writing, and unintentionally hilarious dialogue, has been generally addressed here. If the series hadn't gone under, I wonder if this is where TellTale would have had a return to form somehow. But I do think this is placed in baseless idealism just because the first 2 episodes of a series was decently functional comparatively speaking to the train crash behind it. All in all, this series is for me the second strongest one, but I do want to pick up on something I've noticed about the creation of character that applies to something grander than just the Walking Dead's universe. So these characters, Violet, Lewis, Marlon, and so on, are by and large acceptably built characters. They have motivations, goals, a personality, ideas, and fears. Violet is known for being the quiet, moody one, and Lewis is known for being the comic idealist of the group. Marlon is the strong leader who is crumbling underneath. It's good that I can at least make these character titles to show I see who they are, as previously I wouldn't know what to call most of the characters of season 2 or 3. It's just, I feel like because they fit certain character archetypes, they start to feel like caricatures of people. There's something indescribably different about the people you meet in season 1 to the characters you meet in the final season. I guess if I were to try and describe it, talking to Violet feels like I'm talking to an ephemeral part of her, as if I'm talking to the concept of Violet and what she is as this type of character, rather than just Violet being her. Does this make any sense? She outwardly talks about not being a people person, that it's too bro-town for her liking, and for me, it could have been portrayed this way by other means rather than have her talk to you on one-on-one about all of her issues directly. I'm talking about Violet more here because I chose her side of things in the season, but Lewis had a similar sort of method in explaining away his issues at you. Carley, on the other hand, feels like a real person because she didn't feel like her only purpose was to orbit the protagonist until it was time to die. She wants to be elsewhere with her co-workers and a cup of coffee. The people at the school have their ambitions, but not one of them to me feels like the people The Walking Dead is known to release. They all have this strange, diaphanous quality to their existence that merely has them appear like hallucinations of real people could or should be like. I guess it's a bit of a show not tell issue here. I found the scene with Carley listening to her radio station's crew being overrun with walkers more saddening than Violet talking about being lonely. Violet, Lewis, and the rest of them feel like a softer sort of different characters you'd find in anime archetypes or cartoon characters. There's semblances and clear comparisons to human counterparts, but it's not quite there yet. This isn't necessarily a criticism either, because people enjoy anime and cartoons, but there's a marked difference in the way the characterization is done here. Season 1 has their group be defined by the relationships and values they have in contrast to and in common with one another, whereas Violet, Lewis, and the rest, to me, come across as the values they're aiming to represent. I am the comic relief guy, and I'm here to talk about it. I am the shrinking Violet, pun, and I'm here to talk about it. Take it to any series you have, and you'll find the characters have the same issue. The TV show The Walking Dead feels like cool people shooting zombies now. The Simpsons is a husk of what it used to be. British soaps like EastEnders have been going on so long that the arguments are consistently meme-worthy.
You can't tell me what to do, you ain't my mother! Yes, I am!
And if you saw my World of Warcraft video, the game is dramatically different to its original 2004 release. There's only so many world-ending events, so many divorces, so much family drama you can have before it starts to feel like you're not able to escape to their world anymore. I know this is getting away from the topic a bit, but the more you pour into a series to make its longevity just that season longer, the originality in its character begins to dwindle as we settle down further into its lifespan. The final season, if I were to round up my thoughts on it, it is a good season overall, and I know that the decisions Skybound and TellTale made for the final product of the game were definitely for the best, and for the legacy of a character that's famous for her story, and a wonderful representative for the company, even if that representation is somewhat scuffed and scraped by the previous 2 seasons of content. I may have gone pretty easy on the final season, though, because of what happened to the company, and that it was a discernible improvement in quality over its previous counterparts, save for the first season. There were quite a few issues with the combat, and I sometimes thought there were other ways in which to avoid certain conflicts or situations, but not to the extent that 2 or 3 did. Conclusively though, what do we take from all this retrospective analysis of the entirety of the flagship series for a company that is, as far as we know, is scrounging in the dark for it to finish off its other promises before burning out? Well, branching stories, not really branching stories if you get the same ending in 3 colours, I mean 3 different character outcomes, so maybe companies can learn from TellTale not to advertise that as their slogan almost for every game they produce. Also, do remember to factor in the many different dialogue options for your characters to follow, else you'll have The Walking Dead Season 2 and the plague of character amnesia. But the main thing I want to get at is that media at the moment fucking loves to drip dry every single piece of content that they can have in order to appease fans wanting more, despite a series undergoing its diminishing returns for the quality of its content. There will be its golden period where it has perfected its formula, unless you're TellTale I guess, before its wow factor wanes and we get bored and the fans begin to take over because the directors just don't know what to do with the series anymore for us to like it. That's why there's over 30 seasons of The Simpsons, of Family Guy, 8 seasons of Game of Thrones, or 15 years of Warcraft, or 10 years of this and that and everything. Not everything has to survive. Not everything has to be brought back, and not everything needs to keep going just because the name will keep it afloat long enough to try and recreate the magic of the first few seasons of this thing. In short, boo capitalism, you smell. Anyway though, I think I will call it a night there, as I'm starting to feel like the more I get into this, the more cyclical it will become, so please let me know what you think about this concept of diminishing returns for a series in the comments below. Do comment, do share, do subscribe, and I know it sounds a bit contradictory to ask you to do this while denouncing similar things, but shh, I'm not here to solve, only to complain about why my video games are bad in a hyperbolic manner. So next time, cheers!